First up, 13 women who thought they'd be astronauts.
In the 1950s, television ads promoted the idea of women as full-time homemakers.
Freedom from unnecessary drudgery. Freedom to go shopping when the urge hits you, or when there's a sale going on.
And while this was a popular idea at the time, not everyone bought into it.
New York, and here comes Lady Bird Jacqueline Cochran.
Jackie Cochran was one of America's most celebrated women pilots.
Goody, goody. And she breaks the woman's coast-to-coast record. In the race, she beat a field of 9 top-ranking men flyers, the Queen of Speed.
Jackie Cochran wasn't the only woman pilot breaking barriers in aviation. Jerry Cobb was Woman Pilot of the Year in 1959.
Boy, isn't that a honey?
Say, she is a honey. Meet Miss Jerry Cobb, who's just flown in here to Tyndall Air Force Base to be with us here at Operation William Tell.
In 1961, Jackie and Jerry were contacted by Randy Lovelace, the doctor who had designed the physical test for the first male astronauts.
Well, I feel that the problem will be one of multiple stresses, and I think Captain Barr and General Flickinger feel the same way. And the way the program is set up, I feel that every man here can withstand the stresses to which they will be subjected.
They learn to survive in a variety of hostile environments, including the deserts and jungles of the Earth.
But no American woman had ever been an astronaut. Dr. Lovelace wanted to see if women could survive the same rigorous tests that the male astronauts had gone through. Dr. Lovelace recruited 13 women pilots, including Jerry Cobb, and ran them through the same test. Jackie, who was very wealthy, paid for the test. Jerry Cobb called the group the Fellow Lady Astronaut Trainees, or the Flats. Jerry Truehill and Wally Funk, 2 other women in the group, remembered what the testing was like.
The thing that hurt was when they injected super cold water in our ears.
And that would put you into vertigo. You would actually whirl around and around and around, and they wanted to see how long it took you to recover from vertigo. They said, tell us when you quit spinning. So I said, I'll quit. And they said, no, you haven't. I said, how do you know I haven't? They said, because your eyeballs are still going round and around.
The women performed the test as well as the men had, and in some cases, they did even better. And they proved that women were just as physically and mentally capable. All this time, NASA didn't know anything about Dr. Lovelace's testing program. When they found out about it, they put an end to it.
And we get this telegram.
Regret to advise, arrangements at Pensacola canceled. You may return expense allotment to Lovelace Foundation or by letter to me. We will further advise you.
There was no explanation. There was no thank you very much.
Jerry Cobb set out to prove that women could and should be astronauts. She got press coverage.
Miss Cobb, you argued today that women would make better astronauts in some respects than men. Do you really believe this is true?
This has been proved by doctors and scientists in certain areas.
And she testified before Congress. Yet, it would take 20 more years for NASA to launch the first American woman into space. Too late for Jerry Cobb and the other women who went through testing at the Lovelace Clinic. Jerry and those other pilots paved the way for women like me and, like Eileen Collins, the first woman commander of the space shuttle.
Go and throttle up.
I first started thinking about a career in flying when I was a teenager. I went to the library quite a bit, and I remember taking out a book about the women Air Force service pilots, the WASPs, and their leader, Jackie Cochran. And so, I invited them to come to the Cape that day, the day that my dream was realized. I was the first woman commander of a shuttle. I wanted them there so that they understood they had a role in women's history too. Because while these women were never astronauts, they were pioneers, the definition pioneers. They were out there doing it for the first time, for me, and for all the astronauts who came after them.
Next, During Apollo 11, she was the only woman in the room.
When Joanne Morgan was a kid, she loved experiments and explosions.
4th grade, my dad gave me a chemistry set, and I blew out a little piece of the wall, and luckily, my dad was pretty impressed, I thought at the time. He said, "My goodness, Joanne, how did you do this?" And I said, "Oh, it was the chemistry set, Daddy, the chemistry set."
Joanne grew up on Florida's Space Coast, a good place to live if you liked explosions. She was good at math, and in summer school, Joanne got an engineering job at Cape Canaveral. She worked her first launch a few days after graduation from high school.
I'd already developed a passion for space exploration, and I intended to be a part of it.
But society did not encourage girls to have those kinds of careers.
What have you planned to take?
I thought perhaps I should cancel history and physics. I don't really need them. And take office practice and advanced dictation. I want to become a stenographer.
Yes, that sounds like a reasonable plan.
Joanne wanted to be an engineer, but when she started at college,
there were, at that time, no women in the engineering school. So my counselor, when she went over my exam score, she said, "You would be wonderful if you'd go to the business school." And in fact, she would not let me register except in the arts and science school.
Joanne registered anyway, graduated, and became NASA's first female aerospace engineer. One day, her boss sent her to run some tests. When she got to launch control,
one of the officials there came up and told me, "We don't have women out here."
Instead of leaving, Joanne put her headsets on and ran the test. She needed to get her work done. Her hard work earned Joanne a place with the Apollo launch team, the mission that sent the first men to the moon.
During the Apollo program, it was nothing to work 7 days a week, 28 days straight, no days off. Because we were going to the moon, we launched early in the morning generally, which meant we were doing propellant loading at night, the night before. So you often were coming in at 3 in the afternoon and working to 3 a.m. And being a part of the launch team that launched Apollo 11 to the moon, I was thrilled and happy to be on the launch team.
The day Apollo 11 left for the moon, Joanne spent 3 intense hours at her console, making sure the communications and guidance systems were ready to go.
I was there, right there on that console at liftoff.
And on that historic day, Joanne was the only woman in the room. In the years that followed, she earned promotions, managed multi-million-dollar projects, and became the first senior woman executive at Kennedy Space Center, proving women could be engineers and leaders in a field that was once only for men.
Up next, the woman who taught us how our bodies work in space.
We're here at the National Air and Space Museum, here in our Space Hall, and we're standing in front of Skylab, which was the first American space station, launched in May of 1973. And I'm here with Dr. Carolyn Huntoon, who is a scientist who worked on the effects of weightlessness on human beings, especially in Skylab. So welcome, Carolyn.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
It's very nice to have you here. Now, I understand that your study of human beings and weightlessness began very early. Can you tell me about that work?
Well, yeah. Actually, I was in graduate school at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston and had the opportunity to work with my major professor on some studies he was doing with the Mercury and Gemini astronauts at that time. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot of fun to, I didn't get to know the astronauts, but I certainly became familiar with their blood and urine samples.
What were you looking for?
Well, at that time, it was a complete unknown as to what happened to humans in weightlessness.
Mm-hmm.
So we started with just sort of what you would call routine clinical measurements. Then we started looking at some of the endocrinology that would react to stresses of space flight. The issue, of course, with all the astronauts was, is everything going to be okay when they come home? You know, are they going to be fine, they're going to be healthy or what have you? Because there were a lot of hypotheses that people going into weightlessness were going to have all these terrible things happen to them. Mm-hmm. So we showed right away that did not happen. And then we were saying, well, what was occurring, you know, and all. So by collecting blood and urine samples before and after the flight, we were able to measure various compounds in the urine, hormonal compounds, as well as the electrolytes and things like that, and found some interesting and some significant changes.
Such as?
Well, the big program that we did, and I worked with him the most on, was the Gemini 7, which was a 14-day mission with Borman and Lovell, and those guys were real heroes because they measured everything they ate was a special diet on a cycle, and we collected all the urine before the flight, during the flight, and after the flight, and they have some stories to tell about doing all that.
I'm sure that took a lot of discipline.
If you've seen a Gemini capsule, you know it was a small place.
Yes.
But 14 days was important because that's how long it would take to go to the moon and back. And they figured if these guys were healthy in 14 days, then we don't have to worry about the health of the Apollo astronauts.
Okay.
So when we got all those samples back and analyzed them, we found that there was indeed a change in metabolism in spaceflight. Calcium was lost in spaceflight. And we found out before and after the mission that red blood cells were changed, and that upon recovery after a mission, the astronauts were in a less hydrated state and had lost a lot of fluid and electrolytes.
So how did that affect what was planned for the Apollo mission, and were there similar scientific studies on the Apollo mission?
Apollo, as you know, was to go to the moon and come back and do scientific studies on the lunar surface. There were no medical experiments approved on Apollo. But on the lunar surface, the physicians had the EKG monitors on the astronauts in their spacesuits. And there were some cardiac arrhythmias, and this got everyone's attention real fast.
I imagine. Did that turn out to be a big deal?
It was not a big deal when we got back. The crews were fine. They never had them again. And the doctors decided it was because they were overworked and had not had adequate intake of fluid and electrolytes. So they managed that way. But that was our big Apollo scare. But that also fed into the experiments that I was getting ready for Skylab because they were fluid and electrolyte oriented with the endocrine control system. So that was my opportunity to get everyone more interested in how I wanted to study this in the first place.
I was very interested to ask you about the work that you did on Skylab, because my understanding is in those longer duration missions where you might see more effects on the human beings for a longer exposure to weightlessness, you were actually leading some of the science that was being done.
I did, and we had a terrific opportunity there because it was everything from exercise capability, vestibular, red blood cells, sleep, everything. And calcium was a big issue. And we did all that work, and what made it so special, it was long duration, as you mentioned. There were 3 missions in 28 days, 56 days, and 84 days, I believe. 3 crew members on each mission. And we did the exact same experiment on all 3 of them. It happened, what was nice about all of that was that we had a good baseline before the flight. We got these samples back from flight which showed what happened in weightlessness. Then we had a long period post-flight that we were able to make the same measurements to see when they returned to normal.
And what did you learn? What do you feel like was really learned in terms of the science of the human body?
Well, I think one thing is that the human body is very agreeable to weightlessness. There were changes that were very interesting, and we documented them. And we planned then to proceed with understanding those changes, why they happened. We had a decrease in red cell mass. We had a decrease in calcium balance, even though they were eating a good calcium diet. The bones kept losing calcium. We had a decrease in muscle mass, although they were exercising almost every other day a lot. Their hearts were not working as effectively up there. They didn't have to pump as much because they weren't pumping against gravity. So their hearts became kind of sluggish. That was of interest and something to study for future missions.
Now, that was really groundbreaking research that allowed then the shuttle program and the International Space Station and those longer missions to really come to fruition. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important to continue to study the human body and weightlessness?
Well, yes. As I mentioned, we did observational experiments, if you will, on the Skylab. And we measured a lot of changes. And then you say, well, are these important? And the doctors go, well, what does that tell me, kind of thing. So what you need to do is start dissecting those changes and make more precise measurements. Look at the specific enzymes that change and the time changes and that sort of thing. And those are the experiments that are underway right now on the space station.
Very interesting. Carolyn, this was really a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming.
You're welcome.
And finally, something they didn't learn on Skylab because there were no women on board. There's something that everyone does that women do differently from men, and this is a look at the evolution of how women astronauts do that.
You always get these questions when you go and speak to schools. How do you live in space? How do you sleep? How do you eat? And the most popular question of all time, guess what it is? Probably how to go to the bathroom. How do you go to the bathroom in space?
This right here, the space toilet, this is the most popular item at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. When I worked there, the educator said this was always the first thing kids asked to see. And it always has been. This is from a postcard NASA got in 1961. Americans have been going into space for 63 years, and of course they've been going in space the whole time. Amy Foster, who is a historian at the University of Central Florida, got to be an expert on this subject when she wrote a book on women astronauts in 2011.
Alan Shepard, on his very first flight, he sat on the launch pad for hours and hours and hours after drinking something like 4 cups of coffee that morning, and the man had to urinate.
Shepard peed in his suit, but by the second flight, B.F. Goodrich had come up with a clever idea.
Essentially a condom with a tube attached to a collection bag.
And then this is what John Glenn used. We don't really know what it did, but it is in the Smithsonian. Ask about it next time you're there.
Female crew members have 3 choices for their anatomy-based funnel choices, and they're all vented.
All of this is today, but it definitely didn't start out that way.
It was in the early days of the space shuttle.
Yes, that is Ricardo Montalban.
That women began entering the professional ranks of NASA.
A few years before the agency made that transition, Amy Foster says they started to plan for it.
Joe Cosmo is an engineer at Johnson Space Center, and he was one of the engineers that was assigned to developing the urine collection device for the women.
But Joe and the guys on his team had a big problem.
When I was talking with Joe Cosmo about this design, he talked about a plaster cast model of female genitalia that they had sitting on their desk in the office, basically to use as a model for how to build these things, because otherwise they didn't know what female genitalia looked like.
Let that sink in for a second.
They didn't know what female genitalia looked like.
As you let that sink in, here's the other big thing they didn't know. When women pee in outer space, where does it go?
A group of Air Force nurses volunteered to fly on the KC-135, lovingly known as the Vomit Comet, to pee for the engineers. These nurses volunteered to go up and pee on tape, essentially, so that they knew what they were dealing with in terms of how to design these things.
After the engineers finally had it clear what they were working on, they presented their prototypes to the women astronauts. They were not impressed. Kathy Sullivan called them
fascinating and mainly hilarious combinations of bizarre and ridiculous.
Ray Seddon will be the most open about saying, she'd bring these things home and, lay in the bathtub and convince herself that she needed to pee and give them a try.
Actually, they did more than that.
We would fly on the KC-135 and try to use the thing floating in your 30 seconds of weightlessness and trying to empty your bladder. And we, would wear it walking around a little bit, but it was uncomfortable. It was, sort of felt like it was maybe designed by men.
The program spent a fair amount of time and effort going down some rabbit holes for one key reason, I think, which is that none of the guys could imagine ever wearing diapers.
NASA had this problem with clothing and a lot of things in the 1980s. Up till then, it had been an all-male, all-white institution. Here's astronaut Mae Jemison.
What they wanted to do is make women fit into men's garments, which many times gives you a disadvantage. So there were these kind of things, and I always laugh because they would never put men in women's undergarments and say, let's try to adjust them till they fit.
A lot of things are better now. Women design things, but creating equality at NASA and everywhere else in America can be really, really hard. If any or all of this is news to you, I have a book I want to suggest. It's the one behind me, We Could Not Fail, which I wrote along with Stephen Moss. There's a paperback version, and you can also get it in an audiobook form from Audible.